Pretend for a minute that you are an award-winning, best-selling author of mysteries and thrillers, and then the Ian Flemings estate comes to you and asks you to write a new James Bond novel. Well, what a challenge. But do you want to break out of your successful rhythm of writing for a gamble on something new? How would you decide? Well, we'll find out, because all of this happened to Chapel Hill-based author Jeff Deaver. We'll find out what he did, how he made the decision, and what was the result when we talked to him about his new book, Carte Blanche, on North Carolina Bookwatch. Next.
Funding for North Carolina Bookwatch is made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC-TV, and by the North Carolina Humanities Council.
Welcome to North Carolina Bookwatch. I'm D.G. Martin, and my guest is Jeffery Deaver, who's the author of Carte Blanche. It's also got 007 Carte Blanche on the cover. That's not part of the title, though, is
So
it?
nobody would make the mistake. No, Carte Blanche is definitely a James Bond novel. And it's curious you mentioned that, because part of this project was the marketing of the spy in this era. Now, we think 007, of course, most people know 007 from the movies. James Bond goes back to Sean Connery, and then we have Roger Moore, George Lazenby, and recently Daniel Craig, who I think did a fine job. 1/5 of the world's population has seen a James Bond film. So when it came time to market Carte Blanche, I'm not talking about writing it, we'll get into that later, but to market Carte Blanche, the question came up, we need some iconic element on the cover to make sure people are going to know they're getting not the suave, sophisticated James Bond from the novels of the 1950s and 60s. Many people have read those, but far more people know the films. 007 resonates for that marketplace, and so they put those two numbers, well, the 00 and the 7, very prominently on the cover of the book.
So you're, golly, I've skipped 100 questions to get to this one, but your job, as you saw it, was more to capture the spirit of the movie James Bond, because 1/5 of the world's population have seen or know of the movies, rather than this sort of old line group who, like John Kennedy, who fell in love with the novels.
Sure. Well, in an ironic way, yes and no, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Yes, in the sense that I tried to create a Bond that encapsulated every one of the qualities that every person who knew Bond would expect. For instance, in the original books, he was tough and edgy. You know, the 00 did not mean that he was allowed to kill somebody in self-defense. It meant he was an assassin. He was, on very rare occasions, given the assignment to go out, come up behind somebody, and kill him. He was basically a hitman. He didn't do that very often, and in fact, in some of the books and movies, he never killed anybody. But he had that power.
Authority.
He was legally, well, quote, legally empowered to do that. That was the Bond in the books. At the same time, the Bond in the movies was a bit wry. He had a little sense of humor. He was suave and sophisticated. He was a bit slicker than the Bond in the books. I had to come up with a composite character so that whoever sat down with Carte Blanche was going to say, oh, I know this guy. I like him. He's the fellow I recall from having seen the book, having seen the movie, or read one of the early books, or one of the continuation novels. You know, there were 4 other authors who wrote Bond books after Fleming passed away. And so it was my job, you mentioned challenge in your very kind introduction. Challenge was exactly the word. I had to pull this, and this, and discard quite a bit too.
Well, the other thing, excuse me for interrupting you, but sure. The other thing was you had to decide whether you're going to write this book set in the 1950s and 60s or in the
exactly.
In the 21st,
and
22nd century.
When the estate called me I myself had only one requirement, that I set the book in the present day. My job in writing a thriller is to give my readers sleepless nights, sweaty palms, to show up for class late, I'll say that here at UNC, to show up for work late. I want the book to be a nonstop, relentlessly engaging experience. To set a book in the past, which I've done with some success, takes a lot more work, but it also requires, on the part of the reader, extra suspension of disbelief. And it introduces other elements too. For instance, say I had set the book in the 1960s, 1950s or 60s, when the original books were written. And James Bond needs to call M. He's cruising down the road in his Bentley or Aston Martin. He needs to call M. He screeches off the side of the road, fishes for coins in his pocket, and goes to a payphone. Now, that's what one had to do back then. But a reader, especially a young reader, and I have an audience that ranges from early teens up well into the 80s and 90s, the young reader is going to think, well, why is he doing that? Oh, wait a minute, that's right. There were no mobile phones back then. Perfectly logical, but I've introduced an element that's going to jar the reader out of the book a bit. So I wanted to move Bond into the present day so that the readers were with him 100% of the time.
Well, that raises an interesting question in connection with your writing the book and the marketing of it, and that is are you writing the book to appeal to the millions of readers who are your fans based on the Jeffery Deaver approach to things? Are you writing to appeal to the old James Bond fans who never heard of Jeffery Deaver?
The answer to that question is yes. And I should back up just a little bit. I write for my readers. I have very little patience for authors who say, oh, I write for myself. Of course, I have a vision. It's my reader's job to be challenged, to figure out what I'm about. Well, that's nonsense. You may be a postmodern, relatively obscure craftsperson writing literature. Take a Donald Barthelme, for instance, who writes superb short stories, whose short stories are, to me, they are challenging, and yet I approach the table knowing that he has written a story that serves as its purpose, expanding my horizons about society, about relationships, about politics. He writes for a much smaller audience, but that's fine. He knew the audience 100%, what their level of intelligence was, what their expectations were, what their experience was. I'm an entertainer. That means I write to entertain, and I give my readers exactly what they want, which is not art. It is good, solid, Hollywood, popular fiction entertainment. Well, that means that I had exactly the two challenges you just mentioned. One, to make sure my readers got exactly what they expect. I do a book a year, and my book a year is this: very fast-paced, a thriller that occurs over about 3 or 4 days at the longest, lots of deadlines. Something terrible is going to happen in 2 chapters or 3 chapters. A big surprise ending, followed by another surprise ending, followed by a third surprise ending. Because as you know from Carte Blanche, we're just when we think it's over, it's not safe to go back in the book again.
Frustrated me.
I love doing that. Well, so to shorten my answer a bit, I need to make sure that those fans get exactly what they want with a Deaver book. And at the same time, I have to make sure that the Bond fans are going to get this character who is an international spy, suave, sophisticated, edgy, as I mentioned before, someone who has the bells and whistles, the fast car, the love of wine and drinking. There has to be the romantic interest as well. His rather irreverent attitude toward bureaucracy and the quotidian. Bond was actually quite a philosopher. He had no patience for small-minded people, petty-minded, the hobgoblins of small minds, if I may quote an American transcendentalist. And so I had to bring all of those qualities into one man, and he was the main character of my book. So my goal was to keep everybody happy if I could.
Well, this is my question. I'm not sure anybody else will be interested in this, but one of the things, James Bond is an expert. He's a connoisseur of good food and good wine. And are you just naturally a connoisseur of good food and good wine, or did you have to subcontract out to your friends who are experts to say, okay, here's what James Bond is ordering, and here's what?
I will tell you, I had to do a lot of research into the proper type of weapon for James Bond to have, and certain encryption techniques, and certain methods of what's called tradecraft. That's the business of spying. Had to work with some experts on that. When it came to food and wine, it was all from memory.
Is that
right?
Oh,
Yeah, yeah.
Come on.
Yep,
well, you would
yep,
be
yep.
a great guy to go to supper with.
Well, and I'm not, you know, I will say I'm not pretentious about it. I've had, you know, a relatively reasonably priced red wine with a steak or with a piece of fish, and I've had white wine with a good beef bourguignon, which would be anathema to some wonderful chefs. But I'll tell you why I know this. I grew up in the Midwest, and God bless my mother, a wonderful, wonderful person. Her idea of cooking was to say, where did I leave the can opener now? And we, of course, had a couple of, I'm not going to call them gourmet meals, but we had some food where she would roast the turkey for Thanksgiving and so forth. I learned, I think going out to eat a few times when I was young, that there's more to life than Chef Boyardee. With all respect, and I still enjoy Chef Boyardee. However, there's more to life than that. And so I learned to cook defensively. So I've been cooking for many years now, and with cooking goes good wine, so I know that quite well.
Well, then I'm going to skip ahead to ask you another question that I think everybody would want to know, because everybody's jealous. I mean, you know, we're all envious and jealous of you getting this assignment. And how did you get them to ask you, or did the call just come from the blue, or how did all this develop?
Well, ironic.
And this, I guess, for anybody who joined us late, this is the Ian Fleming estate engaged our guest, Jeffery Deaver, to write the latest James Bond book, Carte Blanche. How did it happen?
Yes, about 5 or 6 years ago, my book, Garden of Beasts, won the Ian Fleming Steel Dagger Award in England, offered through the Crime Writers Association. And I was just delighted to receive that award. I flew to London to accept it, and the award actually was quite nice. It's an actual dagger in the style of the knife that Ian Fleming carried as a spy. You know, he was before he was a journalist. He was in British intelligence, and so I accepted the award, and I was just blown away by this, by the present and by the honor. And in accepting the award, my remarks included my adulation of Ian Fleming and James Bond. And I said, this means so much to me. I started reading the Bond books when I was 8 years old, and I count Fleming as one of my influences in early thriller writing. Well, I can't speak for the members of the estate who were in the audience then and actually gave me the award, but I suspect they took those words to heart and said, well, so Jeffrey has a connection with Ian. Why don't we take a look at some of his other books? I think they liked what they saw, and then called me up about 1.5 years ago and said, would I be interested in writing the next continuation novel? And I debated 5 seconds and said, yes, I'm your man.
Well, those of us who are in business, of course, are interested in the business aspects. Maybe you can't talk about it, but the Ian Fleming estate contributes a lot to the success of this book, and you contribute a lot. You have contributed a lot to the success of the book. So it's a partnership. And so you divide the, how do the royalties go? How does it work?
Yeah, well, first of all, in terms of the actual work, to be quite frank, no, it's my book. They had complete approval rights. They could have pulled the plug the day before publication. I didn't think that was going to happen because I wrote Carte Blanche the way I write all of my books. I did in this case, a preliminary outline, a very short one for me, about 40 pages, sent that in to them along with a bio that I had created of the updated Bond, because of course the book is set in the present day, but he's a 30-year-old or so agent.
He's not a 100-year-old agent,
no,
he's a 30-year-old
nowadays
agent.
you can't get away with saying that 100 is the new 30. You can probably say 100 is the new 80, but I don't think you can say 100 is the new 30. So they approved that right up front. And now I do not play well with others. Let me put it that way. Once they had approved that with some very good suggestions, I retired to my dark room, and much of the book written here in Chapel Hill, and I just wrote the book. And then I submitted the final manuscript to them. They made some more very good suggestions. We did some editing, and out it came. So they had control over the book, but they didn't give me any input in it.
Well, I was talking more not about the creative effort, but the money division.
Oh, the money. Oh, yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. I don't mention figures, but we split everything 50-50, and they own the copyright. This is the only thing I've written of the 30 novels, 50 short stories, many op-ed pieces.
The only time you've ever.
The only time I have agreed to that. It's a licensing arrangement. My name will always appear on the book. That's part of the contract. But he's their character. I was delighted to do that. And to me, it was exactly as you say, a wonderful partnership.
You mentioned, and your fans are always interested in how you work compared to how other authors work. And everybody's got their own methodology, but there is a division between those who scope it out with this sort of 40-page outline that short 40-page outline, and those who are led along the process as the characters develop and guide them. You don't do it that way.
No. There are certain types of novels, to a large extent what I would call a literary novel, by Gabriel Marquez, for instance, or Isabel Allende, Saul Bellow, Jane Smiley, Annie Proulx, some writers I really admire, who I suspect allow their well of creativity to guide and shape the story. But see, those books tend to be more character studies, characters in conflict, and the conflict is a plot element, of course. I create a roller coaster. The analogy I often use is of an airplane. I do not want to get on an airplane built by somebody who calls up the airplane supply store and says, "Bring me a bunch of airplane stuff." Oh, I don't know. Bring me wings and engines and those video games the pilots play up in the cockpit, and wheels you have to land. And I'm just going to take my torch and hard hat and go out in the backyard and see how it goes. Why should a book be any different? Especially a commercial, plot-driven thriller. And I'm not saying my books and thriller writers' books don't have substance. Of course, we look at geopolitical issues, we look at personal issues, psychological issues. But a novel, is a choreographed presentation of characters in conflict. That's my definition of what a novel ought to be. You can only do that choreography if you plan it out ahead of time. And frankly, I'm going to, not that we're talking to many people on air here who are going to see this, but I'll go one step further and say, I think there are a lot of, quote, fine art novels that would benefit from structuring. A little more
organization.
Organization, exactly. Because again, we look at the classic symphonies, Beethoven, for instance, Mozart, Shostakovich. The symphonies, or the pieces they wrote, were all planned out in infinite detail ahead of time, so that when it came time to perform, that was almost an anticlimax. The same way that Alfred Hitchcock was so precise in his preparation of a film, he didn't need to see it at the end because he knew exactly what it would be like. That's the way a novel should be as well. So the 40-page outline was simply for Carte Blanche, was simply to let them know what I was going to be doing in general terms. The working outline was 140 pages, about 150 pages actually. 5,000 pages of research. Took me, in the case of Carte Blanche, a little less time than normal because I was on a compressed working schedule for this book. Normally that takes about 8 months to do the outline and the research. Only then do I sit down and write the book, which I can do very, very quickly.
So you've got it all, you've got your directions. You're more like a journalist. You've got your story outlined and you're ready to do the final.
Everything is planned out ahead of time.
Well, this leads me to, you mentioned earlier that one of the things that you have fun with the book is coming to a conclusion and giving me satisfaction, and then popping up 3 or 4 sentences later and reminding me that, oh no, this one's not wrapped up and we got another
pulling the
crisis
rug right out from underneath here. Exactly.
As you're planning these, what kind, I mean, you must run out of devices to use in these, what would you call them? Post-conclusion.
Yeah,
conclusions.
I just call it multiple twist endings. Yeah, it's my big fear. I have no trouble that I'm going to run out of, I have no worries that I'm going to run out of ideas. I have a file on my computer, I call it ideas, rather cleverly I thought. There must be 100 of them in there. So I always have concepts that I can write a book about that I think will make good thrillers. I do worry that the twists are going to get repeated. And in fact, I've written about 50 short stories or so collected in 2 collections, one called Twisted, the other called More Twisted, again, cleverly. And I write fewer short stories now because I've done the same twist. I don't want to do it over and over again, but that just takes, you know, writing's just like ditch digging. I got to roll up my sleeves and say, okay, I've got to come up with a twist. How am I going to do it? I sit and stare at the ceiling for a long time. So far, especially in Carte Blanche, they seem to work pretty well. Nobody has caught the surprises at the end.
I sure missed it. And you know, we've talked about getting to writing Carte Blanche. We've got just a minute or 2 left to talk, and we must talk a little bit about the book.
Oh.
And so what is your elevator speech about this book, about Carte Blanche?
It's quite simple, as were the original Ian Fleming novels. James Bond has learned through GCHQ. Now, GCHQ is like our NSA. That's the outfit that listens to yours and mine. Oh, I shouldn't say that. To foreign folks.
Like the British newspapers.
The British newspapers. They hack into cell phones and to email addresses and so forth of terrorists and bad guys. And GCHQ has learned that something terrible is going to be happening in about 4 days' time. Thousands of lives are going to be lost. They don't know who's committing this atrocity, where it's going to occur, or what the motive is. It's known only as Incident 20 because it will occur on the 20th of the month in a few days' time. Bond is giving the assignment only that information and a tidbit that there's some connection near Novi Sad in Serbia. And he's off on the chase, and that's it. The book is a roller coaster, a cat and mouse game against by Bond against the villain, Severin Haidt, one of my favorite villains of all of my books. And little by little, I fill in some information, I give some misdirection. There are deadlines. Tomorrow, something terrible is going to happen. Many other lives are going to be lost. Bond may or may
act
not
quickly, and maybe it will. Maybe you can stop it. Maybe you can't.
Make decisions whether he's going to sacrifice these people to make sure Haidt stays in play. And that's basically the story. It comes right down to the big climax in South Africa.
Well, now you say it's plot-driven rather than character-driven, but these are interesting characters. You mentioned Severin Haidt, who's maybe the main villain.
Yeah.
And then you have another villain. But both of these villains are Severin Haidt's involved. He's a progressive processor of waste, and environmentally, he's a kind of an environmental hero. And then your other villain is bringing food to starving South African children, and you make these wonderful sounding people into villains. And I said, well, does Jeff Deaver have it out for nonprofits and people who are?
A lot of people say, what do I have against the earth? Because my main villain is he's a recycler, and he lectures people. Now, this is a James Bond villain, believe it or not. He lectures people about how the North Pacific is the biggest rubbish dump in the world, and getting worse. He does have some rather unpleasant personal habits, however. And I won't go into all the details there. The book actually is PG rated. For instance, I believe in writing a book that's accessible to young people as well. Now, kids are not going to get it. I started reading Bond when I was 8. That's too young. But let's just say that you can kind of figure out that Severin Haidt has some rather unpleasant habits and so forth. But here's an interesting thing about all characters. You're absolutely right that the best plotted book in the world means nothing if you have a cardboard caricature of a villain, and that means making the guy with the gun. You know, he's always the heavy. He has my hairstyle and a ponytail. Right away, we know he's bad, and that the ultimate villain sits in a control room somewhere and dreams of world domination, or he runs a drug or oil company, and that's what a bad Hollywood movie does.
A counteract.
Exactly.
Well, I want to go down that path for another 30 minutes, but our 30 minutes is over.
Oh, it's flown by, hasn't it?
And it's a great for you to talk about your mystery and also give us a insight into the mysteries of writing these very successful books. Thanks for sharing it, and we're proud that you're a part of North Carolina.
Oh yeah, it's great to be here and great to talk to you.
Thanks to Jeffery Deaver for his book, Carte Blanche, and for sharing some of the inside scoop with us today. And thanks to all y'all for listening. And I promise you, you'll come back here next week at the same time. I'll introduce you to another one of North Carolina's great writers. See you then.
Funding for North Carolina Bookwatch is made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC TV, and by the North Carolina Humanities Council.